Well, welcome everyone. I am so happy to have with me today an amazing woman. Carrie Andrews is currently a board certified patient advocate with a diverse background in communications, education, and web development. Nudged forward by her personal and professional past experiences, she has found herself drawn to patient advocacy and end-of-life issues, and is now working as a patient advocate and end-of-life educator. Carrie draws upon her strong communication and organizational skills by offering classes and consultations that help people address their advanced care and death-related concerns fiscally, legally, and emotionally. Not enough people realize the importance of having a strong patient advocate. So Carrie offers services as a patient advocate by attending doctor's visits and helping people navigate their medical condition or situation to ensure that their wishes are upheld when they feel most vulnerable. Carrie now is facing one of her most challenging advocacy situations by helping her own mom maneuver her journey with Alzheimer's. So Carrie, I am delighted to have you joining us today.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm glad for the opportunity to talk with you.
Good. Death, we've often talked together about how death is such a taboo topic. It still remains such a hard thing to talk about. And I think now when the world is kind of facing all of this coronavirus concern, that the underlying fear is really death and the fear of the uncertainty that comes with it. So many of us weren't given permission as a child to talk about death and weren't really introduced to it. Do you remember when you first became aware of your own mortality?
I appreciated that question, and I really had to think about that. My family did not really talk about death or dying, and I don't remember there being a epiphany where I realized I was going to die, but I think I experienced death in my family with grandparents and whatnot in high school, and we did not see them before they died. We did not participate in a memorial. And I was really probably in college when I remember going to a nursing home with a boyfriend's family and to see his grandmother. And I ended up in tears out in the hallway being hugged by a nurse because I could not cope with the whole situation. I was mortified by the whole experience. And she was very close to death, and I had no frame of reference for that.
Right.
So I don't really remember. That really probably didn't change for me until my own father died, which was 10 years ago now.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. And were you with him at his passing?
I was not there when he actually died. I had been with him for the 5 months leading up to his death. And I would say once a month. He was in Minneapolis and I was here in Washington. And my brother was in Washington, D.C. And we would fly in to meet with him once a month. And that really was the beginning of my interest in not only advocacy, but also in end-of-life planning, because I saw firsthand how much easier it was to navigate that, having some things in place. He did have all of his affairs in order, as it were, and it made it so much easier for us to navigate financial decisions and get him into a nursing facility and talk to his doctors. And I just realized, even though he wasn't willing to talk about his own death, and we really didn't know how to advocate for him for what he wanted, we could advocate pretty clearly for what was going to be best for him in the situation he was in. And that was really a life-changing experience for me.
Right. So where did your interest in acting as an advocate, do you think it was with your dad's passing that led you to interest in doing the advocacy part of your work?
Well, it's funny because I did do the kind of advanced care planning with several people after my dad died. And then I found that really that is only as good as all your plans are only as good as your ability to carry them out. And I really found, I have a tendency to kind of tackle things head on, and I forget that not everybody does that. And certainly in the situation of someone who is at the end of life, they are not necessarily making the best decisions. Maybe they're not even able to speak for themselves. And I would say my next real challenge from an advocacy perspective was with my father-in-law when he was dying, and no one in the family was really able to address that. I was the one that kind of pushed for hospice. I was the one that really pushed to get some paperwork in place, that pushed to talk about things. And really, I was very new to the family at that time. And looking back on it, I wish I had stepped in more.
Right.
Because in the end, I really was the one making the decisions and saying, no, let's not force him to drink and insure, because he's within days now.
Right.
And that was not a particularly peaceful death.
Right.
And I feel like, knowing what I know now, I would have stepped in and made that a better situation.
Well, I think people often assume that the person closest to them will be the person best to advocate for them or carry out their advance directive wishes. And I have also found that not always to be the case. It's the same reason why you wouldn't want a doctor to perform surgery on a family member. It's like
Right.
You have specific
Right.
emotional roles, and oftentimes your emotional role can be primarily loving that person rather than standing in that advocacy role. So what would you say are the characteristics? It's like we always do the best we can do and the circumstances are what they are, but what would you say are some of the important characteristics to consider if you're standing in that role as an advocate?
Yeah. One thing I'd just like to say before I address that is that is why I feel it is so, so important for people to talk about what they want, and to really, particularly with couples, because I think there is that assumption that, well, I have a spouse, so they will, of course, be my advocate. And I worked with a couple recently that when I really got them to talk through what their wishes were, the husband realized he really could not advocate for his wife, and the wife realized she could advocate for her husband. And so she ended up finding another, so that is why it is so critical to have that conversation with people. So that said, I think the things, you need to be able to separate enough emotional distance from the decisions that need to be made from the person. And sometimes spouses can do that for each other, and sometimes they can't. I think you need to be organized, able to process information efficiently, effectively, whether that's recording a doctor's conversation or taking notes at an appointment. It's important to keep track of, there's a lot happening, particularly in an emergency situation. The doctors don't tend to ask. They tend to just come in and say, we're going to go do a CT scan, and now we're going to go take some blood, and now we're going to go do x-rays. And I have found, as an advocate, particularly in the ER, you have to keep asking them, because they frankly don't offer the information unless you ask. And so it needs to be a person that is comfortable being, I always say bossy, but it's not bossy, it's assertive. And it's saying, we still don't have the answer we want here. And before we assume we're going down this path, can you give us more information?
Yes. And I have found too that it requires being assertive, and there are certainly ways that you can approach that don't create as much defensiveness as other ways. So
Absolutely. And I guess in my experience, I've found you kind of get one shot at developing the relationship you're going to have with your client's care team. And I have so far been lucky in that I have had good relationships with the care teams for clients that I've had, with one possible exception. And it was because the situation went on and on and on, and we weren't getting answers. And I did have to keep going and saying, still not getting what we're needing here.
right.
And at a certain point, the relationship does go downhill, but that's actually how your client gets help.
Yes. Yeah, I think it's still a learning curve for doctors to accept the role of an advocate, whether it's a professional advocate or the person you've assigned as your advocate, that doctors are hopefully doing their role is to be the doctor, but that they're not accustomed to being questioned. So it is a learning curve.
Right. And I think it's just important to present as a member of the team, not as somebody that's going to be grilling you on all your decisions as a physician, but more, I just want to be sure that we get included in the decision making, in the conversation around what the potential outcomes are. I just find the more upfront you can be, the more receptive doctors have been.
Right.
And there is also, there's an interesting relationship between independent advocates and the hospital system, because the hospital does have what they consider to be patient advocates. But most of the organizations that I belong to really believe that you cannot advocate for a patient if you are being paid by an insurance company, a hospital, advocacy organization even. Independent advocates are still probably your best bet as far as really truly getting care for yourself.
Right. I think another really essential point to make is that as an advocate, this is one of the reasons why it gets tripped up when people are close to one, where there is the emotional attachment, that the advocate needs to keep in mind that they're advocating for that person's interests, and wishes, not theirs.
Right. Yes. And that is for me, I guess, with my work with people who hire me for services, that's much easier than when I'm in a situation where I'm advocating for friends or close family members. And then you do have an additional layer of removal that you need to.
And given that you're walking that journey with your mom right now, I'm sure you're bumping into that.
Yes. And I find I thus far have been able to take myself out of my role as daughter and put myself into my role as advocate. But dementia is a whole different animal in terms of advocating for someone, because you're really not advocating for who they are right now. You're advocating for who they were prior to this disease.
Right.
And that is sometimes at odds with who that person is presenting as now. So that has been a little tricky, especially when you find yourself trying to have conversations regarding end-of-life choices, and the rationale behind being very clear about not wanting to proceed with dementia is no longer really, the thought process isn't functioning the same way. So it's a very odd situation to be in, to find yourself reminding your own parent why they had considered taking their own life.
Right, right. I think Washington State still may be the only state that has an advance directive for dementia and Alzheimer's. Can you explain a little bit about what it is and how it works?
Yes, the Washington State did develop the first Alzheimer's directive, and it's a piece of your advanced directives. It essentially reiterates everything that your advanced directive would cover, but it expressly says, I want this to be in place even if I develop Alzheimer's or some other form of dementia. It goes into great detail about things that you're okay with or not okay with in your own treatment, whether or not you'd be willing to get divorced in order to preserve assets, whether or not you'd want your home sold to fund your care, things like that, decisions that need to be made well in advance of a dementia diagnosis. And what it does not do, I think people assume that, okay, I've got all that in place. What it does not do is give you any more teeth than your advanced directives do. It has not really been legally tested. There have been cases, people often, once dementia has progressed to a certain extent, they no longer really care about being a burden to people or not. Where in their pre-dementia state, they would be very concerned about all of those things. At a certain point, often people get happier. They become more childlike, and they're less emotionally complex. So I think there's it's an excellent tool to work through, partly in terms of thinking about your own values around Alzheimer's and dementia. It's not going to save you from those choices.
Right.
It might help inform the people that are going to be your caregivers as to what your intent was. But it is not, regrettably, Alzheimer's and dementia do not qualify for death with dignity. Right. And so I think there's a little bit of a false hope that this Alzheimer's directive will then say, oh, see, I don't want to be here with this condition. And unfortunately, you cannot want to be there. And the death with dignity law does not apply in this case. So
with the death with dignity law, you have to go through a 15 days apart to
oral consultation, written document. Yeah. So there's a process.
Well, taking the cocktail yourself and
right. And so you also have to be within 6 months of a terminal diagnosis, and Alzheimer's, you do not get a terminal diagnosis within 6 months. People can go for a year, they can go for 10 years. It really depends on the nature of the dementia as well.
How is it defined? I know that in the part of the directive, it's defined as mild, moderate, and severe.
So we're talking about there are two different dementia directives, both of which were developed in Washington. One was developed by a neurologist at University of Washington, and that is the one that you're referring to that has the mild, moderate, and severe. And basically it's asking you a series of 4 or 5 questions, which are the exact same questions, but they apply at 3 different stages of dementia. So for example, if you have mild dementia, and I'm not sure we don't all have mild dementia, honestly, it would ask you certain questions for what kind of care you would want, what sort of measures you would want taken. For moderate dementia, you might, and it does define in very broad terms what each of those stages looks like. And then in severe cases. So what measures you would want taken in the event of an emergency or an illness. Some people say don't do anything. As soon as there's a diagnosis, I don't want anything done. Other people think, well, if I still have a decent quality of life, and there's something that could be done to buy me 6 more months, I'm fine with that. So it's just an opportunity for people to define very clearly at these 3 different stages what it's a backup to their directive, their regular advanced directive.
And then since the death with dignity law doesn't apply with dementia and Alzheimer's, the only alternative is VSED. Can you please describe what that means and when it might be applied?
Yes. So VSED is voluntarily stopping eating and drinking, and it has been around since time began. It has recently come into the forefront more. Phyllis Shatner wrote a book about her husband's experience maybe 20 years ago now, and in which he had been, I don't know that he even had dementia. I read too many things and they get mixed up, but in any case, he decided that he was going to stop eating and drinking, and her book is really about what that process looked like and how that was for them. She went on to document many other case studies, but it is more and more being used by people with a diagnosis that will either, like dementia, that will cause them to be in enough, where they aren't going to be able to make a decision, or other people that have a terminal condition, but it doesn't apply, the death with dignity doesn't apply. COPD, Lou Gehrig's, I mean, there are all kinds of diseases that have a very gradual, and all of a sudden at one point, you are no longer able to take advantage of the medical aid in dying. So anyway, voluntarily stopping eating and drinking, VSED, is increasingly being used by people in one of those categories, including people with dementia. And the hard thing there is that you really have to make that decision before you're ready to die.
Right.
Because if you wait too long, you are no longer able to follow through with that process.
Right.
And it is not a simple process. We're lucky here in our community in that our hospital is very supportive of VSED. They will actually, I think you have to go 36 hours without eating or drinking before they will assign hospice to you. Mm-hmm. But we're very lucky in this community to be able to have access to hospice during that process. Not all hospitals grant that.
Yeah, and it is a really important conversation to have with your primary care physician.
Absolutely. And it's also a good idea to feel out your primary care physician about how they feel about it.
Right.
Because not every doctor is on board with that. And they, by state law, do not have to be on board with that. They do not have to support you, even in medical aid in dying. Even though death with dignity is a state law, they do allow doctors to opt out of it. So it's a really important conversation to have with your primary care physician. And then VSED in particular is much more successful and less painful for everyone if you have hospice involved as soon as possible.
Mm-hmm. And hospice generally is assigned to someone who has been assigned as terminal, correct? So
right.
So it's once they go the 36 hours.
Right. It's a little bit of an end run around the terminal diagnosis, because the medical, I talked to the director of hospice and palliative care up at our hospital, and he said, as far as he's concerned ethically, if you haven't eaten or if you are no longer going to be eating or drinking, you are terminal within 6 months. Absolutely.
Right.
So that's his the way he reconciles that. And he also, there's a growing movement of people that would like to see Alzheimer's included in a death with dignity option.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Tell us about your experience of, as Alzheimer's and dementia progresses, what are the choices if somebody isn't choosing VSED? How does the illness unfold, and at what point is it best for someone to be cared for at home versus assisted living or a care facility?
I think that's really, really up to the immediate caretakers. And in the case with my mother, she lives with my stepdad, and I can see he's taken over all the cooking, the grocery shopping. She is not a danger to herself yet, although every once in a while there's kind of a little blip where you think, oh. She does let people know if she's going to walk to the post office, and she does wear an identification bracelet with her address and my phone number and my stepdad's phone number. Alzheimer's it's an up and down. It's not a steady decline. So there are times and situations that are more challenging than others.
Mm-hmm.
One-on-one, there's still pretty high level of functioning there. In the larger the group is, the more I notice some disconnect. And I don't see the day-to-day progression as much as my stepdad does.
Uh-huh.
So one of the things we've opted to do is get together once a month, and we all three of us, and we first ask Mom what she's noticing, how she thinks she's doing. And then Ned kind of shares what he is noticing. And then I can share what I'm noticing not being there every day.
Right.
And then we kind of talk about, okay, we've developed some optional value statements kind of as a family, and helped Mom. I sat down with her and played a card game with her, actually, called Go Wish, where we identified the 10 things that were the most important to her for end-of-life care. Some of them were kind of surprising. I feel like we've prepared as much as we can, and we have good communication around it. That said, I still have to be the one pushing for the communication and pushing for the meetings, and we're currently evaluating whether or not it makes sense to continue on high cholesterol medication or blood thinners. I met with a doctor to ask about what would the downside to going off of that be, and right. So we're exploring all of those things. And again, I have to get myself into my patient advocate role going into those conversations. But it is what it is.
And so for people who no longer can manage someone at home, how are decisions made?
At that point, and that's, I guess, another advantage to an Alzheimer's directive, particularly the one that's put out by End of Life Washington, is that they do give you an option to specify who you want your mental health care agent to be. Mm-hmm. It defaults to being your regular healthcare agent if you haven't named somebody specifically, and it most likely would be that same person, but that's something to think about too. At that point, you really are looking at how much can an individual caregiver manage, and how much there's help you can bring in to your home up to a certain point. I think there comes a time where people really can't be left alone. Sometimes they wander off, sometimes they leave the stove on. There's all kinds of things that can happen there. And I think that's when you probably are looking at care facilities. In our area, we really only have one that is a designated memory care facility. Otherwise, there are some others around the Puget Sound region. There's a system of homes in Colorado that are all owned by the same parent company, but they're excellent. It's a home basically. It's got 12 rooms, six to 12 bedrooms, of the family style kitchen, dining room, and they've found over and over again that that is the best situation for dementia patients. We do not, unfortunately, have anything like that here, but.
For those people who, I mean, any medical intervention is expensive. So for those families who can't afford assisted living or a care facility, what happens there? I mean, I know that people are concerned.
I am quite honestly not sure what people do that, except if you have any resources at all. I mean, your best case scenario is either you have plenty of money and you can afford care, or you have absolutely no money, in which case Medicaid kicks in. So honestly, for people, the vast majority of us in the middle class will likely need to spend down all of our assets in order to qualify for Medicaid, which then picks up, and even then you're going to get kind of your bottom of the barrel
Care.
Yeah. And so, that's a compelling argument for VSED right there, is to think about everything that you've worked for your whole life being spent down so that you then are on, government assistance to be in some substandard. It's a lot of people believe that taking your own life is wrong under any circumstances. And this is certainly a relatively gentle way to just say, I'm done.
Right.
And it's something that we all have the ability to do. It doesn't cost anything. Other than emotionally, I don't think it's an easy process for your family to go through.
What length of time would you say from the time people choose to stop eating and drinking to the end? So much, I mean, there's so many variables, but.
Yeah, they generally say 8 to 21 days. And 21 days would be on the long end, and it really has to do with liquid. You can go a very long time without food. You can go not as long without liquid. So it can be quite uncomfortable if there isn't some medical assistance, which is why hospice is so important. To have them be part of that process, and to have a doctor that is supportive of what you're doing and can really assist with palliative care at that point, because thirst is an issue. And so people, you can moisten people's lips, you can do things like that, but you really do need to be careful that they're not taking in too much liquid at that point, and you're just prolonging the process.
Right.
I believe you can actually get on Amazon now, and there are VSED kits that you can purchase that have some of those, or at least there's resources available where you can figure out what you need in that.
Right.
And put that together. So there's certain swabs that you can, help reduce some of that.
Right. Well, if you would tell people a little more about your services and how it works when you become someone's advocate.
So I'm working in I have sort of 3 areas. So one is advanced care planning. I teach classes. I work with people one-on-one. I then also can be hired as an advocate to go to doctor's appointments with people, to show up in the ER and kind of talk about what's going on there. The third avenue is I can actually be hired to be somebody's healthcare agent. And so that is an annual contract. I'm basically on a retainer because I can't take too many clients in that capacity. Right. So I can actually be on a retainer to be your healthcare advocate. And in the event that something happens, I would step in and advocate for you,
Mm-hmm.
just as any agent would.
Well, I have found even at this point in my life that if it is more than just a usual general run-of-the-mill doctor's appointment, that it serves me either to record the conversation with the doctor or have someone there to be an extra pair of ears, because when you are in that vulnerable patient place, you don't always remember what was shared.
Absolutely. And I really recommend that for anybody, that bring a friend, bring a spouse, hire an advocate if, just because it is so important going forward, especially if there's some sort of diagnosis, or, a surgery that's been recommended. It's so important to have an extra set of ears and just another person to bounce something off of.
Right, because it does take processing.
Yeah, and doctors tend to come at you and say, here's what you've got, here's what we're going to do. You start on Tuesday.
Mm-hmm.
Please sign here.
Right.
And I think part of what advocates try to do is take a step back, gather all the information, process the information, and then work with the client to make sure that they understand what the pros and cons of what's being suggested are.
Well, and I think formerly I know at least in my parents' generation and trickle down somewhat to my generation, there's the assumption that the doctor knows best.
Right.
And you just follow whatever the doctor suggests. And it's important to ponder and know that you can have a second opinion and know that you can chew on the information and bounce it off of someone to come up with the decision that's best for you.
Right. And I think that does tie back to advanced directives and how important it is to have thought through what is really important to you about your life, not what is important to you about your death, although that's not bad either. But
Right.
If you think through what is important to you about your life day to day,
Right.
it makes it easier. And if you have actually documented that, it makes it easier to play a scenario out for a potential diagnosis, for a surgery, for a course of treatment. How is that course of treatment going to impact your day-to-day life and the things that are important to you?
Right.
And having that documented makes that situation that much easier, because you can say, oh, actually, getting outside is hugely important to me every day.
Mm-hmm.
And this course of treatment is going to mean I am going to likely be in a hospital for the next 6 weeks, and there's a good chance I won't get out.
Right. I know when my dearest friend was in her final days, and as her cognitive abilities declined, it was very helpful to her to read to her her own advance directive, to remind her what she had chosen, you know. And so that advance directive to me is not only the greatest gift to the person who does it, because death is an unavoidable part of life. We all share two things in common. We're born and we die.
Right.
The more you can accept and acknowledge that death is there as the reminder, like you say, to live every moment fully.
Right.
And the advance directive is there. It almost isn't as much for your benefit as it provides the path for those to follow who love you. It's the gift that you can give to them by being clear.
And it is that piece that makes it's a huge peace of mind, because you're carrying out somebody's wishes the way they intended. And it's really a guidance document for your friends and family as much as it is a legal document.
Yes.
Doctors really don't look at those unless there's nobody else around.
Right.
They are going to listen to the person in the room. And if it comes down to a tricky situation, they may want to know that the person in the room has the legal authority to make those decisions. But for the most part, in my experience, I have never been in an ER where somebody asked about advanced directives.
Well,
So,
and I know that it's the statistic, if I'm remembering it right, is 70% of people want to die at home and 70% of people die in a hospital.
yeah,
So having your advance directive together gives the greatest opportunity, regardless of where you are. So that's, years ago, I was a childbirth educator and helped people create their birth plans. And you could plan for the midwife and the birthing tub and all of that, and wind up with a 36-hour labor and a C-section.
absolutely.
So you create the plan, and then you have to surrender it. There's a certain amount of surrender. So at least you have the path to follow until something takes you down another path.
Right.
So
Right. And yeah, being flexible. But I also think if you have your plan and you are clear about how you would like to die, the odds are people are going to be able to help support that better.
absolutely.
Um,
Absolutely. Yeah, even way back when, moms that would want skin to skin to contact immediately after the baby was born, even if they had a cesarean, people knowing that was part of their birth plan would facilitate that.
right.
So it gives people, like you say, the peace of mind knowing that they can have a guide to follow.
Right.
Yeah.
And I know I recently, my mother-in-law died in the fall, and it was a fairly sudden thing in that she had some underlying health conditions, but she went downhill very, very rapidly within the course of really 2 or 3 days. She had been complaining of a cold and just feeling a little off. And we ended up, I called 911 one morning because she had called me and wasn't sure where she was. And she just sounded very confused. And in the hospital, they said she had pneumonia. She'd been without oxygen for so long. And they wanted to start her on a ventilator and start her on antibiotics. And I said, I just don't think that's what she wants. And they were very quick to agree with me. But had I not known that, had I not had those conversations with her, because I was not her healthcare agent, but we couldn't get a hold of her son or her daughter.
Right.
And they did double check her directives and said, oh, I agree with you.
Yeah.
But because I knew that, it
Mm-hmm.
meant they didn't start. And then my husband or his sister did not have to go through and have it removed, which is fairly traumatic.
Right.
And she ended up, they brought her upstairs to a lovely room and overlooking the bay on a beautiful fall day. And my husband was able to get there and we sat with her, and she died within 3 hours.
Yeah.
And it was lovely and it was peaceful, and it wasn't at home. But in some ways, it was less traumatic than if it had been at home. They were able to give her a little bit of morphine and gave her enough oxygen to keep her comfortable. And I would say it was one of the most peaceful deaths I've witnessed, and certainly very quick and just about as good as it gets.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but again, that was because we knew what she wanted. We talked about it with her.
So what would be the most important piece of information or wisdom that you would like to leave with people who are either an advocate or choosing their advocate?
In terms, I just think the most important thing you can do is think about what you want and communicate that. Your advocate can help you digest information, but when it comes down to it, they can't really advocate for you if they don't really know what you want.
Right.
I just had a client ask if I would be her healthcare advocate legally. And I said, yes, but we have a lot of conversations to have, because I've been working with her on one specific piece of her medical situation.
Right.
That in no way is encompassing enough for me to be able to say, I can advocate for you.
Right.
So being clear about what you want, obviously we think that advanced directives are, you know, the thing, everybody should have them. They're going to be used legally about 10% of the time, and they're going to be used as a guidance document about 90% of the time. So even if you don't ever write anything down, my best advice would be to communicate what you want to other people.
Yes. Especially in situations where you have more than one family member by that potentially can be at odds with one another, having that clear path outlined.
Yes.
Helpful.
Yep. Absolutely.
So, Carrie, how can people get in touch with you if they have more questions or are interested in your services?
I have a website, which is peaceofmindpt.com. And I keep that updated with, I have a good book list on there. I have upcoming classes. I have a list of my services. I started a blog recently, and I have some short posts there. I also have a monthly newsletter that goes out, which again incorporates kind of other things that are going on in the community, and you know, it's a good way to keep in touch. But I also, there's a great another website, the Greater, what is it? The Greater National Advocates has just unrolled their new website, and that has a lot of really good, clear information about what advocates do and how advocates might be able to help you with different pieces.
Uh-huh.
And I would urge people to take a look at that, Greater National Advocates. There's some good information about advocacy in general there.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. You know, I just feel so strongly that we should be, you know, having death be a normalized, so it's a part of growing up, the conversation about death, but that everyone 18 or older should have their advanced directive pulled together and then revise it as different situations come along. So
absolutely.
I really appreciate, I feel like the information that you provided today will be so valuable for those, because there is that growing population who are facing dementia, Alzheimer's, and really do need to lean on an advocate at a really challenging adventure. So
we've got a huge bubble coming, and that's going to be a significant issue for us culturally.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Talk to you again soon, I hope.
Okay. Bye-bye.